The pristine lobby of Maxwell Technologies sparkled under morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was barely 8 a.m., and the reception area was already buzzing with employees rushing to their morning meetings. Among them was Mrs. Chen, a senior account manager known for her perfectly tailored suits and reputation for being ruthlessly efficient. On this particular morning, she was more focused than usual. The quarterly report meeting with the board was in less than an hour, and she had spent weeks preparing her presentation. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor as she made her way through security, barely acknowledging the guards' cheerful "good morning." The lobby was unusually crowded for this time of day. As Mrs. Chen navigated through groups of people, her attention was drawn to a man standing near the company's mission statement wall. He wore dark jeans and a simple blazer, decidedly underdressed by the company's standards. He seemed absorbed in reading the silver letters that spelled out Maxwell Technologies' values: innovation, integrity, excellence. Mrs. Chen felt a flash of irritation. The man was blocking her usual path to the elevator. She was already cutting it close with her timing, and now this person was in her way. Without a second thought, she cleared her throat loudly. When he didn't immediately move, she spoke up, her voice sharp with impatience. "Excuse me," she said, not bothering to hide her annoyance. "Could you please do your maintenance work at a more appropriate time? Some of us have important meetings to attend." The man turned slowly, his expression calm and thoughtful. He was holding a sleek leather portfolio, not cleaning supplies as she had assumed. Their eyes met briefly, and something in his steady gaze made Mrs. Chen feel suddenly uncertain, though she quickly pushed the feeling aside. "Actually," he began, but Mrs. Chen had already cut him off with a dismissive wave. "The service elevator is around the back," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the rear of the building. "This area needs to stay clear for executives and clients." She emphasized the word executives as if to underscore the difference between them. A small crowd had gathered near the elevator banks, and Mrs. Chen could feel several pairs of eyes on her. Some people were whispering, others quickly looking away when she glanced in their direction. The man, however, remained unruffled. He simply nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you for the information," he said politely. "But I think I'll take this elevator today." He pressed the up button before Mrs. Chen could protest further. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and to Mrs. Chen's growing frustration, the man stepped in first. She followed, along with several other employees who seemed unusually quiet. The tension in the small space was palpable as they ascended to the executive floor. Mrs. Chen busied herself with her phone, pointedly ignoring the man standing next to her. She pulled up her presentation one last time, scanning the figures she knew by heart. Her confidence was returning with each passing floor. After all, she had earned her position through years of hard work. She wasn't about to let some maintenance worker's lack of protocol rattle her before the biggest presentation of the quarter. The elevator stopped at the top floor, and to Mrs. Chen's surprise, the man exited ahead of her. She watched with growing unease as he walked confidently toward the boardroom, the very room where her presentation was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Something wasn't adding up, but Mrs. Chen pushed the thought aside. She had more important things to focus on. Little did she know, her morning was about to take an unexpected turn that would shake the very foundations of her carefully constructed worldview. Mrs. Chen hurried down the hallway toward the boardroom, her mind racing through her presentation points. She noticed the same casually dressed man from the elevator standing near the entrance, checking something on his phone. This time, her irritation bubbled over completely. "Look," she said, drawing herself up to her full height. "I don't mean to be rude, but the cleaning should really be done after hours. We have a very important board meeting about to start." Her voice carried down the corridor, causing several heads to turn in their direction. The man slowly pocketed his phone and looked at her with that same calm expression that had unsettled her in the lobby. "I appreciate your concern," he said quietly, but I actually need to be here for this meeting. Mrs. Chen let out an exasperated sigh. I'm sure whatever maintenance issue you're dealing with can wait an hour or two. This is a meeting for executives and senior management only. She emphasized each word as if speaking to someone who didn't understand English well. By now, a small group of employees had gathered nearby, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disbelief. Mrs. Chen noticed Mr. Thompson, a junior account manager on her team, trying desperately to catch her eye. She ignored him, focused instead on the problem at hand. Actually, the man began again, but Mrs. Chen wasn't finished. Listen, she said, her professional veneer cracking slightly. I don't want to have to call security, but this area is restricted. The freight elevator and service corridors are clearly marked. I'm sure you were given proper instructions during your orientation. The man's expression shifted slightly, not to anger, but to something that looked almost like curiosity. The freight elevator, he repeated thoughtfully. Yes, you mentioned that earlier. Tell me, how long have you worked at Maxwell Technologies? The question caught Mrs. Chen off guard. 5 years, she answered automatically. But I don't see how that's relevant. And in those 5 years, he continued, his voice still remarkably calm, have you always made assumptions about people based on their appearance? The question hung in the air like a weight. Mrs. Chen felt her face grow hot as she noticed more people gathering in the hallway. Mr. Thompson was now making frantic gestures behind the man's back, but she still couldn't understand why. I'm not making assumptions, she defended herself, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. I'm simply trying to maintain proper protocol. This area is for executives only. Yes, you've made that very clear. The man straightened his blazer and took a step toward the boardroom door. Well then, as the Chief Executive Officer of Maxwell Technologies, I suppose I just barely qualified to be here. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Chen felt the blood drain from her face as the words slowly sank in. She looked around desperately, hoping this was some kind of mistake, but the expressions on her colleagues' faces confirmed a horrible truth. The man, the CEO she'd been lecturing about using the freight elevator, opened the boardroom door. Mr. Thompson, he called to the gesturing junior manager, would you mind getting everyone some coffee? I have a feeling we're all going to need it for this meeting. As people began filing into the boardroom, Mrs. Chen remained rooted to the spot, her carefully prepared presentation forgotten. Her mind raced through every interaction she'd had with him that morning, each moment now painfully clear in this new light. The casual clothes she'd scorned were likely worth more than her monthly salary. The leather portfolio she'd mistaken for cleaning supplies probably contained notes for running the entire company. She watched as other executives greeted him warmly, some shooting concerned glances in her direction. Her perfect morning had unraveled in the most spectacular way possible, and her upcoming presentation suddenly seemed like the least of her worries. Standing outside the boardroom, Mrs. Chen tried to compose herself, clutching her presentation folder like a shield. Through the glass walls, she could see the CEO taking his seat at the head of the table, exchanging pleasant conversation with other board members as if nothing unusual had happened. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her skirt and walked in, heading straight for the presentation setup area. Her hands trembled slightly as she connected her laptop to the projector. The familiar task felt foreign now, her usually steady fingers fumbling with the cables. Mrs. Chen, called a friendly voice. She turned to see Mr. Li, the Chief Operating Officer, beckoning her over. Before you begin, I believe our CEO would like to say a few words. The room fell silent. Mrs. Chen felt every eye on her as she took her seat, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure others could hear it. The CEO leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. I think it's important to address what happened this morning, he began, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had in the hallway. Not to embarrass anyone, but because it highlights an issue that affects many of our employees daily. Mrs. Chen wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. She stared at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. At Maxwell Technologies, he continued, we pride ourselves on being an inclusive workplace. Yet sometimes, our unconscious biases can reveal gaps between who we think we are and how we actually behave. He paused, looking around the room. I chose to dress casually today because I wanted to understand how our employees are treated when they don't match certain expectations. What I experienced was enlightening. Mrs. Chen felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, determined not to cry in front of the entire board. However, the CEO's voice softened slightly. This isn't about placing blame. It's about learning and growing. Mrs. Chen, would you like to share your thoughts? The invitation caught her off guard. She had expected to be immediately fired, not asked to speak. Looking up, she met his gaze and saw no anger there, only patient expectation. Her voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again. I am deeply sorry for my behavior this morning. I made unfair assumptions, and I treated you disrespectfully. There's no excuse for that. She took another breath, forcing herself to continue. I've always thought of myself as a fair person, but today showed me I have biases I wasn't aware of. I understand if you want my resignation. The CEO shook his head. That won't be necessary. Instead, I have a different proposal. Our diversity and inclusion programs clearly need strengthening. Would you be willing to work with HR to develop more effective training programs based on your experience? Mrs. Chen looked up in surprise. You want me to help? After how I behaved? Sometimes, he replied, our most powerful learning moments come from our mistakes. Your experience today could help others recognize and address their own biases. That is, if you're willing to share it. Around the table, several board members nodded in agreement. Mr. Li gave her an encouraging smile. Yes, she said firmly, feeling a mix of shame and determination. I would be honored to help. And I want you all to know that I'm committed to doing better, to being better. The CEO nodded approvingly. Excellent. Now, I believe you have a quarterly presentation for us. Mrs. Chen stood up, her legs still shaky, but her resolve strengthened. As she made her way to the front of the room, she realized that while this morning had been humiliating, it might also be the most important wake-up call of her career. Her presentation suddenly seemed trivial compared to the larger lesson she had learned about respect, dignity, and the danger of making assumptions about others. The quarterly meeting proceeded, but nothing felt normal anymore. Mrs. Chen moved through her presentation slides mechanically, her usual confidence replaced by a gnawing awareness of every word she spoke. The numbers and graphs that had seemed so important just hours ago now felt trivial compared to the weight of her earlier actions. As she discussed market trends and growth projections, she couldn't help but notice how the CEO listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about her analysis. His professional courtesy only made her feel worse. Here was a man she had treated like a maintenance worker, now showing her more respect than she had shown him. Your projection for the Asian market is interesting, he commented, pointing to a graph on the screen. What factors led you to these conclusions? Mrs. Chen took a deep breath, grateful for the familiar territory of market analysis. As she explained her reasoning, she noticed other board members nodding along. Despite everything, her work was still solid. The realization gave her a flicker of hope. Perhaps she hadn't completely destroyed her career. Halfway through the presentation, Mr. Lai from International Operations raised his hand. I'm curious about the diversity metrics in our expansion plans, he said. Have we considered how our company culture might impact our success in different markets? The question hung in the air like a pointed reminder of the morning's events. Mrs. Chen felt her face grow warm again, but she forced herself to address the question directly. Actually, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. This morning's incident has made me realize there are significant gaps in our approach. I would like to revise this section of the report to include a more comprehensive analysis of cultural competency and its impact on our global operations. The CEO leaned forward, interest sparking in his eyes. That's an excellent point. In fact, I think this could be a valuable addition to all our quarterly reviews moving forward. Would you be willing to take the lead on developing these metrics? Several board members turned to look at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and assessment. Mrs. Chen realized this was more than just a chance to redeem herself. It was an opportunity to create real change. I would be honored, she replied, meaning every word. Though I think it's important to acknowledge that I have a lot to learn first. Don't we all? Commented the CEO with a slight smile. Learning is a continuous process, and sometimes our most valuable lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. As the meeting continued, Mrs. Chen noticed subtle shifts in how people interacted with her. Some seemed more guarded, while others showed unexpected support through small gestures. An encouraging nod, a sympathetic smile. Mr. Li even stayed behind to help her pack up her presentation materials, something he'd never done before. You know, he said quietly as they gathered her papers, what matters isn't just what happened this morning, but what you do with it going forward. The CEO was still in the room, speaking softly with two other board members. As Mrs. Chen prepared to leave, he called out to her. Mrs. Chen, could you stop by my office tomorrow morning? There are some people in HR I'd like you to meet with. I think your perspective could be valuable as we revise our company-wide training programs. She nodded, grateful for the deliberate way he was helping her transform her mistake into an opportunity for growth. As she walked back to her office, she noticed people quickly turning away, pretending they hadn't been watching. Word had clearly spread through the office grapevine. Instead of hiding in her office as she'd planned, she decided to head to the break room for coffee. If she was going to help change the company's culture, she needed to start by facing her colleagues. The conversations wouldn't be comfortable, but she was beginning to understand that real growth rarely was. The break room fell silent when Mrs. Chen walked in. A group of junior associates who had been chatting by the coffee machine suddenly became very interested in their phones. She could feel her eyes on her back as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands still slightly shaky from the morning's events. To her surprise, Mr. Thompson, the junior manager who had tried to warn her earlier, approached her. That was a tough meeting, he said, keeping his voice low. But I think you handled it well, especially at the end. Mrs. Chen stirred her coffee slowly, considering his words. I should have noticed your signals earlier, she admitted. I was so caught up in my own assumptions that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. We've all had moments we wish we could take back, he replied, then hesitated before adding, though maybe not quite so publicly. Despite herself, Mrs. Chen let out a small laugh. The tension in the break room seemed to ease slightly. A few other employees drifted closer, no longer pretending to be absorbed in their phones. One of the marketing coordinators cleared her throat. I heard the CEO asked you to help with the diversity training program, she said. That's unexpected. Life is full of unexpected turns, Mrs. Chen replied, thinking about how differently this day had gone from her careful plans. This morning, I thought I was just giving a quarterly presentation. Instead, I got a masterclass in checking my own biases. More people joined the conversation, sharing their own experiences with prejudice and misconceptions. One team member talked about being mistaken for a delivery person despite wearing a suit. Another mentioned how people often assumed she was a secretary rather than a software engineer. The thing is, Mrs. Chen said, really listening to their stories, I always thought I was above all that. I've faced discrimination myself as an Asian woman in business. But today showed me that experiencing prejudice doesn't make you immune to perpetuating it. The conversation was interrupted by a message on everyone's phones. An email from the CEO announcing a company-wide meeting about workplace culture and unconscious bias. Mrs. Chen's incident wasn't mentioned specifically, but everyone knew what had prompted it. "Well," said Mr. Thompson, "looks like your morning is going to help create some real changes around here." Back at her desk, Mrs. Chen began researching diversity and inclusion programs. Her normal afternoon tasks lay forgotten as she dove into articles and studies about workplace bias. She was so absorbed that she almost didn't notice Mr. Lee stopping by her office. "The CEO asked me to check on you," he said, leaning against her doorframe. "He was impressed by how you turned the situation around in the meeting." Mrs. Chen looked up from her computer. "I still can't believe he's giving me a chance to make things right. Most CEOs would have fired me on the spot." Mr. Lee nodded thoughtfully. "True leadership isn't about punishing mistakes. It's about creating opportunities for growth. Speaking of which, HR would like to record your story for their training materials, if you're comfortable with that." The thought of sharing her humiliating experience with the entire company made her stomach clench, but Mrs. Chen knew it was the right thing to do. If it helps prevent someone else from making the same mistakes, I'm willing to do it. As the afternoon sun slanted through her office window, Mrs. Chen reflected on how a single morning had completely changed her perspective. She had walked into work thinking she would simply deliver a presentation. Instead, she had delivered herself a harsh but necessary lesson in humility and awareness. Looking at the family photo on her desk, her daughter in her college graduation gown, she wondered what other biases she held without realizing it. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time since the morning's incident, she felt truly hopeful about where it might lead. The next morning arrived with a knot of anxiety in Mrs. Chen's stomach. As she walked through the lobby, she noticed how differently she viewed everyone around her. The security guard who always greeted her, the cleaning staff maintaining the spotless floors, the IT technician fixing someone's computer. They were no longer just background figures in her daily routine. Her meeting with HR was scheduled for 9 a.m. She arrived early, clutching a notebook filled with ideas she jotted down the night before. Sleep had been elusive, so she'd spent hours researching and reflecting instead. The HR director welcomed her warmly into a conference room where the CEO was already waiting, along with 2 diversity consultants. The sight of him made her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but his friendly nod helped ease her tension. "Thank you for coming in early," he said. "Before we start planning the new training program, I wanted to share something with you." He opened a folder and pulled out several printed emails. "These are messages I received from employees after yesterday's announcement. Many of them shared their own experiences with workplace bias." Mrs. Chen read through the emails, her throat tightening. Stories of missed promotions, dismissed ideas, and casual discrimination filled the pages. Some were from people she worked with daily, people whose experiences she had never bothered to understand. "What strikes me," the CEO continued, "is how many people stayed silent about these experiences. They feared speaking up would harm their careers. Your incident, as uncomfortable as it was, has opened up an important conversation." One of the consultants leaned forward. "That's why we'd like to start with your story. Not to shame you, but to show how even successful professionals can carry unconscious biases. Would you be willing to record a video sharing your experience?" The thought made her nervous, but Mrs. Chen thought about all those unheard voices in the emails. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'll do it." They spent the next hour outlining a new training program. Mrs. Chen shared insights from her own background, times she'd faced discrimination, and now, times she realized she discriminated against others. The consultants listened intently, taking notes and offering suggestions. During a coffee break, the CEO pulled her aside. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly, "but your willingness to learn from this situation is exactly why I chose not to fire you. Sometimes our most painful moments can lead to the most meaningful change." Back at her desk later that morning, Mrs. Chen opened her email to find dozens of messages from colleagues. Some expressed support for her bravery in facing her mistakes. Others shared their own stories of bias and prejudice. One email particularly caught her eye. It was from the maintenance supervisor. "Your story reminded me of times I've judged others unfairly too," he wrote. "We all have biases to overcome. Thank you for helping start this conversation." That afternoon, Mrs. Chen gave her first interview for the training video. Under the bright lights, she recounted every detail of her interaction with the CEO, the assumptions she'd made, the way she treated him, and the lessons she'd learned. "The hardest part wasn't the public embarrassment," she told the camera. "It was realizing that I had become exactly what I once resented, someone who judged others based on appearances. But through this experience, I've learned that acknowledging our biases is the first step to overcoming them." As she left the recording session, she spotted her team gathered in the break room. Instead of dispersing when she approached, they waved her over. Someone had brought in homemade cookies, and they were discussing their own experiences with prejudice, both receiving and giving it. For the first time since the incident, Mrs. Chen felt like maybe her mistake could lead to something positive. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but at least now people were talking about it openly, and that was a start. A week had passed since the incident, and Maxwell Technologies felt like a different company. The diversity training video featuring Mrs. Chen's story had been shared across all departments, sparking conversations in every corner of the building. She'd caught glimpses of herself on computer screens as she walked past cubicles, still finding it surreal to see her experience being used as a teaching moment. During lunch, she noticed something interesting in the company cafeteria. People who usually stuck to their departmental groups were now mixing more freely. The maintenance staff, once relegated to their own corner, were sharing tables with executives. The cleaning crew was joining in conversations about weekend plans with marketing teams. Mrs. Chen sat with a mixed group, including 2 accountants, a janitor, and a software developer. They were discussing the changes they'd observed in the past week. "You know what's different?" the janitor said, between bites of his sandwich. "People look me in the eye now. They say good morning. Small things, but they matter." The software developer nodded. "I've noticed managers actually listening when junior staff speak up. It's like everyone's more aware of how they treat others." As they talked, Mrs. Chen spotted the CEO entering the cafeteria. Unlike before, he was wearing his usual business suit today, but instead of heading straight to the executive dining room, he got in line with everyone else, chatting casually with an intern who looked both nervous and thrilled. "He's been doing that all week," one of the accountants whispered. "Leading by example, I guess." After lunch, Mrs. Chen had her weekly team meeting. Before starting the agenda, she noticed one of her younger team members looking anxious. "Is everything all right?" she asked. The young woman hesitated, then spoke up. "Actually, I've been wanting to share something. Remember last month when I suggested that new market strategy? The one you dismissed without much discussion." Mrs. Chen felt her chest tighten. She did remember, though she'd never thought much about it until now. "I wonder," the team member continued, "if you would have given it more consideration if it had come from someone more senior, or someone who looked more like your typical idea of a business strategist." The room fell silent. A month ago, Mrs. Chen might have become defensive or dismissed the concern. But now she took a deep breath and really thought about it. "You're right," she admitted. "I probably would have. And I'm sorry for that. Would you be willing to present your strategy again? This time, I promise to listen with an open mind." The surprise and appreciation on her team member's face made Mrs. Chen realize just how much her own transformation was affecting others. The meeting turned into an open discussion about times they'd felt dismissed or overlooked and how they could do better as a team. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Chen received an email about the company's new mentorship program. The CEO had asked her to be one of the lead mentors, specifically working with employees who felt marginalized or overlooked. "Your experience," he wrote, has given you a unique perspective. You understand both sides of the equation now, what it feels like to be discriminated against, and how easy it is to discriminate without realizing it. That knowledge could be invaluable to others. As she typed her acceptance, Mrs. Chen thought about how much had changed in just a week. The shame of that morning was still there, but it was gradually being transformed into something constructive. She was becoming known not just for her mistake, but for her commitment to learning from it. Looking out her office window at the busy street below, she watched people rushing past each other, making their own unconscious judgments. How many of them, she wondered, were carrying biases they didn't even recognize? And how many opportunities for connection and growth were being missed because of those biases? 2 weeks into the company's new diversity initiative, Mrs. Chen found herself standing at the front of the training room, facing a group of new employees. Her hands weren't shaking anymore when she told her story, though her heart still beat a little faster when she reached the part about her confrontation with the CEO. The hardest part wasn't the moment I realized my mistake, she told the attentive faces before her. It was facing myself afterward, looking in the mirror and asking, how many other prejudices am I carrying without even knowing it? A young intern raised his hand. But how do you recognize your own biases? If they're unconscious, how do you know they're there? It was exactly the kind of question Mrs. Chen had been asking herself lately. Sometimes, she replied thoughtfully, it helps to pause before making any quick judgments. Ask yourself why you're making certain assumptions about people. Question your first impressions. During the lunch break, she overheard 2 participants discussing the session in the hallway. I always thought I was pretty open-minded, one said. But listening to her story made me think about all the times I might have jumped to conclusions about people. Yeah, the other agreed. Like yesterday, when I assumed the woman in jeans couldn't be the project leader. Turns out she's the head of engineering. Mrs. Chen smiled to herself, remembering her own similar assumptions. Later that afternoon, she had a meeting with the HR director to review the impact of the new training programs. The statistics were encouraging. Employee feedback showed increased awareness of workplace bias, and more people were speaking up about their experiences. Your story has become a powerful tool for change, the HR director commented. People relate to it because it shows how anyone can make these mistakes, but also how they can learn from them. As they discussed future plans, Mr. Lee knocked on the door. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here you should meet. He stepped aside to reveal a woman in casual business attire. This is our new VP of Operations, he announced. Mrs. Chen stood up immediately, extending her hand. 2 weeks ago, she might have made assumptions based on the woman's youth or casual dress. Today, she simply said, "Welcome to Maxwell Technologies. I'd love to hear your ideas for the company." The new VP smiled. "I've actually heard a lot about you. Your training video is being shared at other companies now. It's starting conversations about workplace bias across the industry." The news took Mrs. Chen by surprise. She hadn't expected her story to reach beyond their company walls. That evening, as she packed up her desk, she noticed a small gift bag hanging on her door handle. Inside was a coffee mug with a note from her team. "Thanks for teaching us that it's okay to admit our mistakes and grow from them," the note read. "You changed more than just yourself. You've changed our whole workplace culture." Looking around the office, she saw people from different departments chatting easily together. The maintenance supervisor was having an animated discussion with a group of analysts. A security guard was helping an executive with his keycard, both laughing at some shared joke. These small interactions might seem insignificant to an outsider, but Mrs. Chen knew better now. They represented the breaking down of invisible barriers that had existed for too long. As she headed toward the elevator, she held the door open for a woman in workout clothes who was carrying a laptop. "Thanks," the woman smiled. "I'm running late for a client meeting." "No assumptions made here," Mrs. Chen replied with a knowing smile. "Though I do know a thing or two about misjudging people based on their clothes." They both laughed, and Mrs. Chen felt that familiar mix of embarrassment and gratitude. Her mistake had been painful, but it had sparked a change that was bigger than herself. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful lessons come from our most humbling moments. 1 month had passed since that fateful morning. Mrs. Chen stood in the same lobby where it all began, watching the morning crowd filter through the entrance. But this time, she saw things differently. Each face had a story. Each person had value, regardless of their role or appearance. The CEO had called an all-hands meeting for that morning. As employees gathered in the main conference hall, there was a different energy in the air. People who once would have clustered in their usual groups were now mixed together, chatting easily across departmental lines. 1 month ago, the CEO began, standing at the podium. An incident in our lobby sparked a change in our company culture. Today, I'm proud to announce that Maxwell Technologies has been recognized as a leader in workplace diversity and inclusion. Mrs. Chen felt eyes turned toward her, but for the first time, she didn't feel shame. Instead, she felt a quiet pride in how far they'd all come. Our new training program, he continued, has been adopted by 5 other major corporations. What started as a difficult moment for one person has grown into a movement for positive change across the industry. He went on to share the results of their latest employee satisfaction survey. Reports of workplace discrimination had decreased significantly. More importantly, employees reported feeling more comfortable speaking up about their experiences and concerns. After the meeting, a young custodian approached Mrs. Chen. "You know," he said, "I used to hide in the back corridors during my shifts. I felt like I was supposed to be invisible. But now, people stop and talk to me. They know my name. It might seem small, but it matters." Later that day, Mrs. Chen had her monthly review with the CEO. The office where she'd once feared being fired had become a place of open dialogue and growth. "I have a proposal for you," he said, sliding a document across his desk. "We want to create a new position, Chief Diversity Officer. Given your unique experience and the impact you've had, I think you'd be perfect for the role." Mrs. Chen picked up the proposal with trembling hands. "Are you sure? After how we met?" "Perhaps because of how we met," he replied. "Your story has authenticity. You've lived both sides of this issue. That's valuable." As she walked back to her office, processing this new opportunity, she passed the company's mission statement wall, the same spot where everything had changed a month ago. Someone had added a new line. "Growth comes from acknowledging our mistakes and learning from them." In the break room, she found herself in line next to the maintenance supervisor. "Did you hear?" he asked excitedly. "They're implementing that training program you suggested. The one about seeing people, not positions." Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering how she'd once treated maintenance staff as invisible. Now, they were helping shape company policy. The supervisor was on the diversity committee, bringing a vital perspective to their discussions. At the end of the day, as she gathered her things to leave, she found a small package on her desk. Inside was a framed photo of the lobby, with a note from her team. Where one person's journey of growth began, our whole company's transformation followed. Standing in the elevator, Mrs. Chen reflected on how a single morning had changed not just her career, but her entire worldview. The doors opened at the lobby, and she stepped out, nodding warmly to the evening cleaning crew. Outside, the setting sun painted the city in golden light. A month ago, she would have rushed past everyone, focused only on her destination. Today, she paused to hold the door for others, exchanging smiles with people she once would have overlooked. Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter. "Mom, my professor used your training video in class today. You're famous for all the right reasons now." Mrs. Chen smiled, thinking about how our worst moments can sometimes lead to our best transformations. As she walked to her car, she passed countless people, each with their own story, their own value, their own journey. And now, finally, she could truly see them all.